On July 19th in 1553, after only 9 days as the monarch of England, Lady Jane Grey is deposed in favor of her cousin, Mary. The 15-year-old Lady Jane, beautiful and intelligent, had only reluctantly agreed to be put on the throne. The decision would result in her execution. Lady Jane Grey was the great-granddaughter of King Henry VII and the cousin of Edward VI. Lady Jane and Edward were the same age, and they had almost been married in 1549. In May 1533, she was married to Lord Guildford Dudley, the son of John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland. When King Edward fell deathly ill with tuberculosis soon after, Jane's father-in-law, John Dudley, persuaded the dying king that Jane, a Protestant, should be chosen the royal successor over Edward's half-sister Mary, a Catholic. On July 6, 1553, Edward continued his eternity, and 4 days later, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen of England. Lady Jane's ascendance was supported by the royal council, but the populace supported Mary, the rightful heir. 2 days into Lady Jane's reign, Dudley departed London with an army to suppress Mary's forces, and in his absence, the council declared him a traitor and Mary the Queen, ending Jane's 9-day reign. On July 20th, most of Dudley's army had deserted him, and he was arrested. The same day, Jane was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Her father-in-law was condemned for high treason, and on August 23rd, he continued his eternity. On November 13th, Jane and her husband, Guildford Dudley, were likewise found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. But because of their youth and relative innocence, Mary did not carry out the death sentences. However, in early 1554, Jane's father, Henry Grey, joined Sir Thomas Wyatt in an insurrection against Mary that broke out after her announcement of her intention to marry Philip II of Spain. While suppressing the revolt, Mary decided it was also necessary to eliminate all her political opponents, and on February 7th, she signed the death warrants of Jane and her husband. On the morning of February 12th, Jane watched her husband being carried away to execution from the window of her cell in the Tower of London, and 2 hours later, she continued her eternity. There is some debate about this date, but the consensus is that it was likely July 19, 1799, during Napoleon Bonaparte's Egyptian campaign. It was on this date that a French soldier discovers a black basalt slab inscribed with ancient writing near the town of Rosetta, about 35 miles east of Alexandria. The irregularly shaped stone contained fragments of passages written in 3 different scripts: Egyptian Demotic, and Greek and Egyptian hieroglyphics. The ancient Greek on the Rosetta Stone told archaeologists that it was inscribed by priests honoring the king of Egypt, Ptolemy V, in the 2nd century BC. What brought more inquiry was that the Greek passage announced that the 3 scripts were all of identical meaning. The artifact thus held the key to solving the riddle of hieroglyphics, a written language that had been dead for nearly 2,000 years. When Napoleon, an emperor known for his enlightened view of education, art, and culture, invaded Egypt in 1798, he took along a group of scholars and told them to seize all important cultural artifacts for France. Pierre Bouchard, one of Napoleon's soldiers, was aware of this order when he found the basalt stone, which is almost 4 feet long and 2.5 feet wide, at a fort near Rosetta. When the British defeated Napoleon in 1801, they took possession of the Rosetta Stone. Several scholars, including Englishman Thomas Young, made progress with the initial hieroglyphics analysis on the Rosetta Stone. French Egyptologist Jean-Francois Champollion, 1790 through 1832, who had taught himself ancient languages, ultimately cracked the code and deciphered the hieroglyphics using his knowledge of Greek as a guide. Hieroglyphics use pictures to represent objects, sounds, and groups of sounds. Once the Rosetta Stone inscriptions were translated, the language and culture of ancient Egypt was suddenly open to scientists as never before. Today, the Rosetta Stone is housed in the British Museum in London, despite repeated calls for it to be returned to Egypt. On July 19th in 1848, at the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York, a women's rights convention, the first ever held in the United States, convenes with almost 200 women in attendance. The convention was organized by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, two abolitionists who met at the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. As women, Mott and Stanton were barred from the convention floor, and the common indignation that this aroused in both of them was the impetus for their founding of the women's rights movement in the United States. In 1848, at Stanton's home near Seneca Falls, the two women working with Martha Wright, Mary Ann McClintock, and Jane Hunt sent out a call for a women's conference to be held at Seneca Falls. The announcement, published in the Seneca County Courier on July 14th, read, quote, "A convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women will be held in the Wesleyan Church at Seneca Falls on Wednesday and Thursday, the 19th and 20th of July current, commencing at 10 o'clock a.m. During the first day, the meeting will be exclusively for women who are earnestly invited to attend. The public generally are invited to be present on the second day, when Lucretia Mott of Philadelphia and other ladies and gentlemen will address the convention," unquote. On July 19th, 200 women convened at the Wesleyan Chapel, and Stanton read the Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances, a treatise that she had drafted over the previous few days. Stanton's declaration was modeled closely on the Declaration of Independence, and its preamble featured the proclamation, quote, "We shall hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights," unquote. The Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances then detailed the injustices inflicted upon women in the United States and called upon U.S. women to organize and petition for their rights. On the second day of the convention, men were invited to attend, and some 40 did, including the famous African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass. That day, the Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances was adopted and signed by the Assembly. The convention also passed 12 resolutions and 11 unanimously, which called for specific equal rights for women. The ninth resolution, which declared, quote, "It is the duty of the woman of the country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise," unquote, was the only one to meet opposition. After a lengthy debate in which Douglass sided with Stanton in arguing the importance of female enfranchisement, the resolution was passed. For proclaiming a woman's right to vote, the Seneca Falls Convention was subjected to public ridicule, and some backers of women's rights withdrew their support. However, the resolution marked the beginning of the women's suffrage movement in America. The Seneca Falls Convention was followed 2 weeks later by an even larger display of power in Rochester, New York. Thereafter, national women's rights conventions were held annually, providing an important focus for the growing women's suffrage movement. After years of struggle, the 19th Amendment was adopted in 1920, granting American women the constitutionally protected right to vote. On July 19th in 1942, the agricultural chemist George Washington Carver, head of Alabama's famed Tuskegee Institute, arrives in Dearborn, Michigan at the invitation of Henry Ford, founder of the Ford Motor Company. Born to slave parents in Missouri during the Civil War, Carver managed to get a high school education while working as a farmhand in Kansas in his late 20s. Turned away by a Kansas university because he was an African American, Carver later became the first black student at Iowa State Agricultural College in Ames, where he obtained his bachelor's and master's degrees. In 1896, Carver left Iowa to head to the Department of Agriculture at the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute, a school founded by the leading black educator Booker T. Washington. By convincing farmers in the South to plant peanuts as an alternative to cotton, Carver helped resuscitate the region's agriculture. In the process, he became one of the most respected and influential scientists in the country. Like Carver, Ford was deeply interested in the regenerative properties of soil and the potential of alternative crops such as peanuts and soybeans to produce plastics, paint, fuel, and other products. Ford had long believed that the world would eventually need a substitute for gasoline and supported the production of ethanol, or grain alcohol, as an alternative fuel. In 1942, he would showcase a car with a lightweight plastic body made from soybeans. Ford and Carver began corresponding via letter in 1934, and their mutual admiration deepened after Carver made a visit to Michigan in 1937. As Douglas Brinkley writes in Wheels for the World, his history of Ford, the automaker donated generously to the Tuskegee Institute, helping finance Carver's experiments, and Carver in turn spent a period of time helping to oversee crops at the Ford plantation in Wayne, Georgia. By the time World War II began, Ford had made repeated journeys to Tuskegee to convince Carver to come to Dearborn and help him to develop a synthetic rubber to help compensate for wartime rubber shortages. Carver arrived on July 19th in 1942 and set up a laboratory in an old waterworks building in Dearborn. He and Ford experimented with different crops, including sweet potatoes and dandelions, eventually devising a way to make the rubber substitute from goldenrod, a plant weed. George Washington Carver continued his eternity in January of 1943. Henry Ford continued his eternity in April of 1947, but the relationship between their two institutions continued to flourish. All historic information documented on this audio file can be verified on history.com.